Now we're going to take a look at social inequalities, just a little bit about social inequalities, really, and social movements, which would be the largest portion of this part of the lecture. Once again, a couple of basic ideas when you get into this topic, one of which is social class. And social class is the term that's used by sociologists to describe our structures of inequality. Now, in the United States, our social class really is where we fit in the socioeconomic ladder. Although it isn't just about economics, it's also about things like our work and our family structure, and also includes things like race and gender as well. And all of those things combined to determine our social class. There are different kinds of thoughts about inequality because where we stand on that ladder, that socioeconomic ladder, the social class ladder, it has so much to determine. It determines so much really about our life that we have to ask ourselves about inequalities and what causes those inequalities. And conservative thinking is that inequality is the natural order, it's the divine order, that there's nothing really you should do to alter it, that some people are of higher standing than others in society, and that's really essentially just the way it goes. It's all kind of the survival of the fittest and divine design, so to speak. The radical antithesis about social inequality is that equality is the natural and divine order, that we all are born as equal human beings, and that the inequality in the society is based on the abuse of privilege by the powerful and should be minimized. Now, there's different kinds of sociologists or thinkers that have addressed the issues of inequality, and Karl Marx might be the one that we're most familiar with, I suppose. And Marx believed that class consciousness and communal class action are inevitable. I mean, he divided the world into the owners and the workers, the bourgeois and the proletariat, so to speak, and believed that there would be class conflict because the workers would always be abused and misused by the owners, and until such time as they became unhappy and then revolted against that. So Marx really saw an inevitability in terms of class action and social movement, so to speak. Max Weber, on the other hand, saw social class as possible but not inevitable in determining identity and social action. Another big difference between Marx and Weber is that Marx really thought that economics were the driving force for identity, and Weber really saw other areas of social institutions as being more key to identity. In fact, looked at religion as one of those things that might be one of the strongest sources of identity. Now, in sociology, really, these are two of the three perspectives in sociology. We talked some weeks back about the social interactionalists and how they view the way that we interact with each other on an individual level, and that is kind of more of a micro sociology viewpoint, whereas macro sociology has these two theories that kind of order our view of the world, and one's the functionalist theory, the other is conflict theories. Functional theories look at structural inequalities, that is, the existence of those social classes, as necessary for society, and they believe that the inequality serves a function, that rewards are given to different kinds of work, so that talented people who work hard and produce the innovations are the ones that get rewarded the greatest. And so it benefits all of society, including the lower social classes as well. And so this is something that, well, the functionalists look at society as sort of like an engine. All the different parts of the engine have to work properly in order for the car to go, so to speak. And so to keep the society moving, basically to grease the wheels of our society, structural inequality is one of those parts that enables society to function properly. Herbert Gans, who I believe was a professor at Columbia for a number of years. I understand that he was a refugee from the Nazi regime in Germany But anyway, he taught for a long time at Columbia, and he wrote a book, or rather wrote an article called "The Uses of Poverty: The Poor Pay All." And essentially, he talked about how, poverty serves a lot of different purposes, and the society needs poor people for this reason, and people to stay poor. First of all, that they take the jobs that nobody else wants, and will accept lower pay because they have to, and so that helps employers to be able to make a better profit as well, and that enables those producers then to make more products, so the society, including again the poor, can benefit from that. He also says the poor, for instance, they help employ people like prison workers and social workers. If it wasn't for the poor, what would we do with ourselves? And although, when I read that article for the first time, it seemed a little tongue in cheek. He's really talking honestly there, and that's a functionalist view about poverty. Conflict theorists, again, this ties into Marx's theory, and feminist perspectives are really very much hand in hand with conflict theories. And again, feminists really focus upon gender as the primary issue, but conflict theorists in general look at the role of power and domination and coercion and how they maintain inequalities. Those people in power, the wealthy, the ones who have a lot of income and a lot of wealth, usually are the ones that have the social and political power, and you also have to just look at Congress today and see that's the case, and they use that power to protect their privileged positions. Now, mind you, this isn't only about our elected representatives, but also take a look at the people who contribute to those elected representatives, contribute to their campaigns, the organizations that have a lot of money, for instance. That, now remember, organizations, according to the Supreme Court, really have to be looked at as people as well, so they donate these large sums of money to causes that support certain candidates and those kinds of things. So people that have the wealth and income really are the powerful individuals in this society. And so again, they're invested in maintaining that power and maintaining their position, and so they use that power to ensure that happens. And so the result is, laws are defined that really, for instance, divvy out more severe punishments for the kinds of crimes that individuals in the lower social classes might be more apt to commit. Drug offenses, for instance, and those kinds of things. Whereas the kinds of crimes that the wealthy will commit, white collar crime, really doesn't generally speaking, they don't suffer the kinds of consequences that are near as harsh as a blue collar crime does. There are different views about debates about social inequality. The neoliberalist view argues that free trade and free markets in a global sense, with very limited government interference, results kind of automatically in the fair distribution of resources. And I would extend this to say that this from an economic perspective, the economic institution in the United States, I think it is more aligned with conservative rather than liberal in thinking. It basically says that just keep your hands off the market, and the market will take care of everybody, and those that it doesn't take care of, well, they shouldn't be taken care of anyway because they're a drain on society. They're not healthy for our culture. Structural adjustment. This particular approach to inequality says that poor countries in the world need to clean house by reducing government spending and bureaucracy, and by increasing exportation and entrepreneurship. So again, the World Bank imposed a lot of these kinds of restrictions on the poor countries in order for them to be able to have the World Bank lend them money to relieve some of their debt or extend their credit, I suppose. And once again, the thought is here that these are the powerful individuals in the world, the powerful entities in the world that are controlling those that are less powerful. In the world system's perspective, basically structural adjustment implies there that poor countries are poor through their own actions, that they need to be more careful with the money and their budgets, and less well, just more careful with things. And doesn't that really reflect the attitude about poor people in America? It's their fault that they're poor, and if only they worked harder, or they got better education, or they didn't do drugs, or they stopped drinking, or stayed married, or whatever it is, they stop having so many children, whatever it is that they have to do, they wouldn't have to be poor anymore. It's all within their control. It's the same kind of approach, I think. And in a world systems perspective, this suggests that inequality is created and maintained by economic globalization. The structural theory about poverty in individual poverty is here applied to the world in looking at rich nations and poor nations. So here's the discussion about structural determinism versus human agency. Durkheim was a functionalist sociologist, by the way, and he believed that human behavior was really very determined, very highly determined by one's position in the social class structure. And you can look at different kinds of sociological theories. For instance, how when you look at behavior, that for instance, working class parents tend to use physical discipline more than parents who have a college education and are white collar workers. That they tend to use power in their relationship with their children more than those that have more education, who tend to use induction and the whole idea of sitting down and talking things out more. It's just one example of how Durkheim thinks that the behavior is determined by our position in the social class structure. It reflects a lot of other things those theorists think that go on in that person's life. The working class individual, for instance, probably has a boss who, is top down leadership, and he does what his boss tells him to do. So when he goes home, he's the boss, and he, extends the same kind of structure into his family system. Human agency emphasizes the capacity of human beings to create their own realities and to give certain roles to human actors, not to social structures. Central roles to human actors, not social structures. So essentially, Max Weber, being one of these people that suggested that it wasn't inevitable that there would be a conflict between classes. That it was a choice of human beings of how to act, and here human agency emphasizes that we can act despite our position in the social ladder to create our own reality. Structuration theory, that's kind of an interesting word. It kind of blends these two together. It says that while there's constraints that rules and resources place on human action, human agents do have the ability to make a difference in their social world within those constraints. Just as individual agency is necessary for individual change, collective agency is essential for changing social institutions, and that's where the concept of social movements come into play. Social movements are ongoing, and that's an important thing there. It's not just a one-time thing, it's an ongoing kind of effort. Ongoing, large-scale collective efforts to bring about social change or to resist social change. And so there are two different types of social movements mentioned here. Proactive, which really is reform, focused on reform of the existing arrangements in society to try out new ways of living together, whereas a reactive social movement is intended to defend traditional values and social arrangements. You really just have to kind of take a look at the news, and in this day and age, and you see all sorts of proactive and reactive movements going on in terms of a number of controversial modern day issues in our society and in the United States. I have seen many other lists of social movements, types of social movements, and this is really a simplified description of the various kinds of social movements. Some of those other definitions of social movements might include like reactionary social movements, conservative social movements, revisionary, revolutionary, escapist, expressive. Each of them have different kinds of focuses in terms of the kind of things that they're trying to change, but they're all really kind of focused on social change, either bringing it about or resisting it. Social movements are distinguished from other kinds of social collectivities, as it's called, because, first of all, they're involved in some sort of relationship with opponents, clearly identified opponents that have something of a conflict going on between them, that they're linked by dense informal networks, and that they share a distinct collective identity. Now, there's different perspectives on social movements and how they occur, I guess, is what it would be. And one of them, I think there are four different perspectives here. One of them is the political opportunities perspective, which says that, there's an assumption that social institutions in our society, particularly the political and economic institutions, have a benefit for the more powerful members of the society, the elites of the society, and they disadvantage most of the rest. So that's one assumption of a political opportunities perspective. The elites are the ones who have routine access to the political channels in the institutions, and so they can bring about change and manipulate those institutions in a way that improves life for them. The disadvantaged do not have those accesses, and so these institutions then, while sometimes are set up and maintained by the elites, are not necessarily invulnerable to challenge all of the time. There are times when it's possible to challenge those institutions, and social movements develop when that window of opportunity opens up. Perhaps an example would be of this, just one that comes to mind very easily in American culture, is the gun debate and the mass shootings that have gone on, for a number of years. This going back even to some of you wouldn't remember Columbine because you might just have been born by that time, but after that event, I think it was 1998, I believe it was, a couple of the parents of the victims took up cause of trying to get gun control laws established around the nation, and were become very famous speakers in that cause. But it just so happens coincidentally that around the time of that shooting, just a week or two later in Denver, not far from where the shooting occurred, I believe it was the NRA was having their national convention, and their keynote speaker was Charlton Heston, who is a famous NRA member. And in the face of, just within the nation was still raw from that experience. And Charlton Heston stands before the convention and holds up a rifle or a weapon of some sort in his hands and declares, "From my cold, dead hands," and to the roar of the crowd, of course. And that kind of set the stage for the sort of debate that has gone on ever since over the last few decades. And so each time another shooting occurs and there's another group of victims, creates another opportunity for that debate to be brought up again. And each time there seems to be a new way that the agitators, let's say those that are trying to change the system, seem to try to approach it. So that after the Sandy Hook shootings, that was the parents of those little children who, a lot of people thought at that time that was going to be a big watershed moment. It proved to be not much change, if any, from that. I think Connecticut changed its gun laws, but that was about it. But the parents became strong advocates then, and remain strong advocates and appeal for your involvement in their cause. After the Las Vegas shootings, there was where the gunman was in the hotel and shot down into the crowd of concert goers and killed so many people. He used what was called a bump stock, which turned his semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon. And there was a lot of talk about banning bump stocks, which at that time kind of faded away. Then after the Parkland, Florida high school shootings, the students have become, a big voice in terms of, gun control, agitation, and those kinds of things. Each time there's something different being done. Whether or not change occurs is another thing, but because they're really agitating against a number of different of the institutions in society, the political institution seems to be among the most immutable ones at the moment in that. What determines when political systems are receptive or vulnerable? Four factors. First, the openness of the political system. Neither and the It's an interesting thing. This one theory says that a political system that's totally open and accessible to change doesn't really inspire a lot of people to try to get change, because it's so easy to happen. And those that are so closed, people don't even try because there's no way of changing them. But neither full access nor its total absence encourages the greatest degree of collective action. If there's some belief that there's a way in, there is some way to create change, then that's the thing that encourages the collective action. But the success of one movement can open up the system to other challenges of similar movements, or they can also develop counter movements that are sort of a backlash and work against them. Another factor that affects the vulnerability of the political system is the stability of political alignments. At the time of transfers of power, like in our system, at the time Congress changes or the presidency changes, or at a time when maybe somebody is falling from grace politically or something like that, there's a time when alliances are being split. That's a good time for the social movement to take action. Are there elite allies, influential people who promote the success of the movement? That's another thing that can be very helpful at times. And finally, sometimes national social movements are influenced by international events as well. Things going on around the globe sometimes can help more national movements create change. The mobilizing structures perspective in social movements basically focuses upon the need for social movement leaders to look for and to mobilize people, money, information, ideas, skills, all those resources that are necessary to make a social movement work, so that costs and can be reduced and benefits are more fruitful, so to speak. So that you want to try to get people that a lot of people and have money and that have the skills that are needed to make this social movement work. This perspective looks at mobilizing structures, informal networks, and formal organizations that people can use to mobilize and engage collective action. So these are called the building blocks of social movements, these structures. There are professional social movement organizations that are out there that can provide advantages in that they already have a structure set up to engage individuals. And so sometimes persons interested in social movements may benefit from aligning with a professional SMO, but they can also they may also have the tendency to tame the movement, and it was suggested in the text, I think, that was one reason why the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy Anything movement, really consistently resisted any kind of leadership structure or whatever being imposed upon them, because they were concerned that it would tame the movement. Unfortunately, with that movement, it never seemed to really kind of get its focus or direction. It just didn't seem to have any movement in the movement, so to speak, even though the message was pretty clear and perhaps brought, in its own way, brought attention to the problem with inequalities and the existence of such dramatic inequalities in our society. There are also transnational SMOs such as Greenpeace and Amnesty International that really work all over the world. The network model looks more at engaging people that on a grassroots level, those natural networks, and the advantage to those grassroots organizations, because they meet in homes or churches or whatever, is that it's something that the government really has a hard time controlling, or the elites, I should say, have a hard time to control. So they can sometimes be more persistent in their efforts that way. But using existing structures minimizes the costs again, and that's certainly a consideration in any kind of social movement. Now, information technology has become very big in terms of mobilization efforts, and as I mean, I think you're very aware. It's like, for instance, in the Arab Spring movement and earlier, in the 2011 to 2014 period of time, where one revolution to another occurred throughout the Arab world, overthrowing or authoritarian regimes, or attempting to do that at least. And a lot of that had something to do with communication through social media. Eventually, social movements have to organize in order to stay alive, and whether they get a formal organization, they contract with another organization or not, and this tends to tame them down, as was mentioned a little while ago, and they begin to become a little bit like the institutions that they challenge to begin with, and ultimately the movement is going to fail unless the movement can find new ways to stay vital and maybe respond to different kinds of needs in a way that keeps them from falling into bureaucracy. The NAACP might be an example of that, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was instrumental in the civil rights movement in the 60s, and yet, after Martin Luther King's assassination and everything, the SCLC really kind of more or less disappeared from the civil rights movement, and the movement itself seemed to die out. And although the SCLC continues to exist, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference continues to exist today, it's much more bureaucratic in nature, and doesn't have the force of that the civil rights movement had in the 1960s, when it was less of a more formal organization. Cultural framing perspective looks at how movement leaders develop shared understandings and definitions of the situation. And really what it talks about is this consciousness raising is so necessary to shape shared understandings of the world, and of how that world impacts them, and how they can impact the world, how they can take collective action and change things. You have to kind of convince people and shape their understanding of this, and this is called cultural framing. So symbols, metaphors, cognitive cues take these issues and put them into a familiar light, and give some suggestions about how movement or individuals in a movement might respond to the changes. Sometimes those frames are attractive to some groups and rejected by others, and the text uses an example of the Black Lives Matter movement, which created really as the next point says, you have to be prepared for backlash and counter movements. There was quite a backlash that was created around that, and there was a lot of, I think, misinformation about what the Black Lives Matter movement was all about and what its intentions were, so whether the movement failed to define that for its own members, or whether the movement failed to define it for the larger society, there's a large part of the society out there that doesn't really understand what it's about and what it's for. Also, there's a point here about the leaders and the followers often split between moderate and radical stances, and it talked about, I think, Martin Luther King being just brilliant in his use of the extremists in the civil rights movement, although he himself remaining a pacifist and avoiding criticism for his movement because of the fact that his methods were all peaceful protest methods. Yet he also made it clear in some of his speeches. I think the notion is that if you don't respond to these peaceful demonstrations, and begin to create change in your city, you're going to wind up responding to somebody like Malcolm X, who had a much more militant approach to civil rights, and was really kind of ready to get in there and if not be violent, at least to threaten violence in a much more direct way than anything the civil rights movement ever did. At least on the SCLC side. So King was able to make use of that more radical element in pushing his own moderate agenda. So you develop frames for understanding that a problem exists, and you name the frame: children's rights, marriage equality, the 99%, those kinds of things. You have a frame for recognizing when there's a window of opportunity. You create awareness that the opportunity for change exists at a certain moment in time. You have frames for establishing goals. Which goals are best? Is this a reformist movement where we look at just changing some elements of society? Or is it a revolutionary movement that would change the larger society, to its very core? And the point made here, modest and winnable objectives in the early stages of a movement help to reinforce the possibility of change. I always like to take these these larger frameworks like social movements and relate them to things that we can connect with on a personal level, and this makes me think a little bit about writing case plans, where one of the basic tenets of a case plan: don't overwhelm your clients with too many goals at one time, and start the client out with goals that are achievable for them, something that they can actually do, because as they begin to see that they can create change, then they become more invested in the process and they're willing to take bigger steps. But if you start them out with a goal that's too impossible for them, they'll feel defeated and they won't do it. Likewise, here in framing the goals of a social movement. And then finally, what's the best pathway for action? What method is the best way to go about it? Is it strikes, marches, rallies, sit-ins, those kinds of things? I think the text pointed out that sit-ins have kind of become, passé more or less. That they were a big deal in the '60s, but in the '70s, but they're not quite as popular as they once were. Marches are much more, and rallies seem to be much more popular these days. Violence, though, tends to destroy public support for any movement, and so it is really recommended that social movements follow nonviolent processes. A few perspectives on social movements that are emerging now. First, the energy of a social movement starts with the transformation of emotion into action. I think about the aforementioned incidences of gun violence and how the emotion of that moment, whether it be the parent or the student survivors or the parents of children who were lost or whoever it might be, that there's a lot of energy there in that anger, that grief that follows the event, and can be translated into action. And it might be a time, I think, probably social movement organizers are probably working that at those moments. And the other thing is social movement theorists, let's say, are looking at why some people see societal change as a major priority, but others don't. A few people will throw, maybe if they even do this, might make a contribution, but really not get too engaged in a cause otherwise. And what is the difference? What defines the difference? And that can help you a little bit in figuring out perhaps how to motivate people, but also who to engage in social movements. So with all that, and from the previous lecture, what do we take away from this for social work practice? First, we should develop our information retrieval skills so that we can keep abreast of all the trends that's going on in all these social institutions in our society here and around the world, and how these things impact human interdependence and human dependence. Pay attention to public policies and poverty and inequality, and address the injustices that may exist in those policies. I added that part. Be aware of the impact of trends in economics on client resources and functioning, and also in your own ability to do your work and do your job. How does it affect your job and your agency? Cutbacks that are proposed, or funding, perhaps supplemental funding that might actually be accessed. Collaborate with other human service workers and social workers. Join together to advocate for equality of opportunity in the educational institution, really in all institutions. work to ensure that the voices of the poor and the oppressed are included in ongoing public dialogue. Again, not only about the healthcare reform, but about all our institutions. But really, it is those individuals in the lower socioeconomic groups, the poor and the oppressed, who don't have a voice and who need some assistance in getting the attention of the institutions in society. And that's one role you have there. Look at the ways that the contemporary social welfare programs are responsive to changes in other social institutions in our society, so that because all these institutions are interrelated, and we should always keep that in mind. Look at how religious organizations affect the lives of our clients and also play a role in social service delivery. Collaborate with other workers to influence media coverage of vulnerable populations. It's good to make use of the media to help people see social inequalities as they exist. Look for political opportunities for social reform efforts and develop the skills you need in order to engage in those reform efforts. Know how to recognize and mobilize formal and informal networks for social reform activities. Barack Obama was a community organizer. This is what he did before his political life, at least before he was elected to office, I should say. And finally, be skillful in developing those frames. Begin to understand how to frame certain situations that might catch the attention or catch the eye of the public and of others, that might help people get on board with whatever cause you are trying to bring about through collective action. Well, that's it. And if questions remain about this, please do contact me about it. But otherwise, I'll talk to you next week.